welcome to Beneath the Covers. My name is Emily, and today we are joined by our special guest, Anya Jabour. She was this past year the historical consultant on the PBS miniseries Mercy Street, and she is also a professor of history here at the University of Montana. Welcome, Anya.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about what you do.
Here at the university or
Yes.
on Mercy Street?
Yeah, here at the university.
Here at the university. Well, I am a professor in the history department. I've been here since 1995. I teach courses in U.S. women's history, the history of American families and children, and the history of the American South. I have also just recently finished up my second term as co-director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and in that capacity I also co-taught with Beth Hubble, who's now the full-time director, both the senior capstone for WGSS majors and minors and a new Global Leadership Initiative seminar called Women's Rights and Women's Roles Around the World. So pretty much everything I do has to do with women's history or contemporary women.
Wow, it sounds like it keeps you very busy.
It does.
It's great. And was that how you were able to get onto Mercy Street?
It is, actually. Not that this was planned remotely, but my research for a couple of decades, more than a couple of decades now, has been on women, families, and children in the 19th century South. And among those projects was a book titled Scarlet Sisters, Young Women in the Old South, which is about women between the ages of about 15 and 25 and their coming-of-age experiences. And one chapter of that book was about the Civil War and about the ways in which the Civil War created some new opportunities for these women who were kind of poised at the brink of adulthood and who were anxious to fulfill a larger role in the world but had never previously had the opportunity to do so, and then the war offered many of them that opportunity. And that message, I think, really resonated with Lisa Wolfinger, who is the showrunner and executive director and co-creator and pretty much the force behind Mercy Street. So about 3 years ago, maybe closer to 4 years ago, she conceived the idea of doing a show on the Civil War. And in the course of her background research for that show, she read Scarlet Sisters, and then she called me up and asked me if I would serve as a script reviewer for the pilot about 3 years ago. And I said, absolutely, why not? Wow, two of my favorite things.
Yeah.
Women in the Civil War South and fiction. How could this be any better? And yeah, and then it just kind of went from there after I'd been consulting on the script for a couple of years, and she got the go-ahead from PBS to actually produce the show. She asked me to come and be on set as one of the on-set historical advisors during filming in Virginia. So I was on site in Virginia for 5 weeks for that work.
Wow, that's a wonderful opportunity.
It is definitely out of the norm for a, yes, mild-mannered academic.
So tell me a little bit about what you did on the set of Mercy Street.
Sure. So what I did on the set of Mercy Street were a couple of things. First of all, I met with almost all of the principal actors and had pretty long conversations with them and with the director and with Lisa about their character and the background of their character. In other words, giving them the kind of historical background that they needed or wanted in order to really identify with their character and kind of understand where their character was coming from. So not so much in terms of the lines, which of course I'd already looked at because I'd been involved in the script writing process, but in terms of how they were going to deliver the lines, how they were going to emote, basically, right? So for instance, I had a really long conversation with Donna Murphy about child rearing methods in the Old South and about how elite white women like Jane Green, the character she portrays, would indeed have breastfed her own children if health permitted, and if her child had significant health problems, which one of the children in the show, Jimmy Green Jr., has a disability, and so he would have required extensive health care in his childhood, and that she would indeed have been the one who would have been in charge of that, of administering that care. And so that's not in the script anywhere, because in the script Jimmy's in his early 20s, right? But she wanted to know that because it informed the way that she would interact with him as her son. She wanted to know what a mother-son relationship would be like. And similarly, I talked a lot with Hannah James, who plays the older Green daughter, Emma Green, and Anna Sophia Robb, who plays the younger Green daughter, Alice Green, about sister relationships and the ways in which sisters would have related to one another in the 19th century. And so, contrary to what some people think of as sisterhood being a state in which siblings are in a sort of a constant state of competition, 19th century Americans really celebrated the idea of sisterhood, both in actuality, meaning people who were in fact related by blood, but also in terms of a kind of a spiritual kinship among all women. And so that meant that sisterly relationships were supposed to be characterized by love and affection and mutuality and altruism and caring, and definitely everything not competition, not that at all, in fact. So I talked with them about that. So kind of very deep background. So that's one thing that I did. And then, an entirely different kind of background, the portion of the show that is not scripted is the extras. And there were a lot of extras, and they played an incredibly important role. I had never given any thought, frankly, to the background actors and what they brought to a production before I was working on Mercy Street. And then I worked on Mercy Street, and I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, this is what makes it feel like a world and not a stage.
Yeah.
Right? That there's background action and there's people doing believable things, and you don't really notice them, but if they weren't there, you would notice that, right? Or if they did something wrong, you would notice that.
Yeah, it would stand out.
So, and that's what really makes it feel like you're actually in the Union-occupied town of Alexandria, Virginia in early 1862, is that you have anywhere between 100 and 150 extras in non-speaking roles doing stuff in the background while the cameras are focused on the principal characters in the foreground. So those are all non-speaking roles, so of course they weren't in the script, so none of it was scripted.
Yeah.
So that all had to be figured out on site, right? So the director, or more often the assistant director who was in charge of the extras, would talk with me about what would be realistic things for these people to be doing in the background. You know, if the children were playing games, what kind of games would they be playing? If men and women were walking together, how would they do that? How close would they stand? Who would stand to which side? Because this show is set in a town in which people of different statuses and different politics are literally brushing up against each other all of the time. So you've got Union soldiers and officers, and you've got Confederate loyalists, and then you also have contraband, African Americans, and they're all kind of jostling together a bit uneasily in this shared space without shared beliefs. And so another thing that I did a lot with was sort of how people from those differing statuses and different political standpoints would be likely to interact when they met one another in the street, right? Who would yield to whom? And under what circumstances would somebody follow protocol and follow the kind of established norms of social interaction that tended to reinforce social hierarchies? And under what circumstances would they intentionally deviate from those norms in order to make a political point? So those are the two kinds of, I guess, background action that I was involved in. Deep background for the principals, and then literally the background actors.
Wow. That is really amazing.
It was really an amazing experience. It was a tremendous learning experience for me. I had never done anything like that before, nor had I ever even envisioned doing anything like that. The whole thing was a great surprise to me.
Yeah, I bet. So kind of going along the idea of womanhood at this time, how would the women and the men have expressed their sexuality during this period? Or not express their sexuality?
Well, the answer to that question varies depending on the social status of the people in question. So everything from their race, their class, their age, their marital status, all of those would have played factors in the degree to which they express their sexuality. So one of the things that I did consult with the scriptwriters and the folks on set about was about courtship, because there are several love relationships being depicted in the film Mercy Street, and so there were lots of questions about, what would be appropriate courting behavior, and particularly for the elite, because both Emma Green and Alice Green have beaux who are, Confederate soldiers, and so there were lots of questions about, what degree of intimacy would have been permissible between them, which is a complicated question because the rules guiding courtship relaxed somewhat during the Civil War. But when I say they relaxed somewhat, I don't mean that they just went away. So there were still very strict guidelines, but the guidelines were different for a courting couple than they were for an engaged couple. The guidelines were also different for a courting couple who had known each other since childhood than they were for a courting couple that only met as adults. So it mattered, in that sense, that Emma and Alice, the backstory is that both of their love interests were in fact betrothed to marry them, albeit secretly, and that permits an extra level of physical intimacy. And then they had also, the backstory tells us, known each other since they were children and had played together as children, which means that they would have had a higher degree of emotional intimacy than your, quote, standard courting couple, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of sort of open expression of sexuality, I mean, when I say they had more relaxed strictures, what I mean is that they could kiss and embrace. That was pretty much pushing the outer edges of propriety.
Yeah.
Having said that, lots of elite white Southerners wrote in their wartime diaries and letters and memoirs that there were lots more out-of-wedlock births than there had been before the war. So clearly not everyone was actually abiding by those strictures that you were supposed to stop with kissing.
Yeah.
But nobody writes about themselves doing it. They write about somebody else producing the obvious results, i.e. a baby.
Yeah.
But they don't describe engaging in those activities themselves in period records. So that's a little difficult to get at in terms of the written record. But we do know that there were more out of wedlock births in the Civil War era. They usually seem to have involved older, more experienced men and younger women. And when I say younger, I mean probably below the age of 18, who were suggestible, is perhaps one way to put it, and not people of similar age, like the Greens and their fiancés. So out of wedlock pregnancies seem to involve more couples where there was a significant disparity in which the male partner had a significant power advantage over the female partner. And of course, he also had the advantage that, when he got shipped off to the front, he went off to the front. She stayed home and got pregnant and had a baby and dealt with that, which was not a good thing to deal with.
Yeah.
Another way that sexuality comes up in Mercy Street, though, is with prostitution, because the Civil War was a boon for sex workers. It provided a constant stream of customers in the form of visiting soldiers, and there were really very few laws restricting the practice of street prostitution or brothel prostitution, but street prostitution was more common in the Civil War era. Military encampments and military occupied towns were kind of a field for sex workers to make much better money than they might have in other circumstances. So there are a lot of prostitutes in Mercy Street. Having said that, even prostitutes, I mean, they present their sexuality in a much more open way. They flaunt their sexuality. But when I say they flaunt their sexuality, I don't mean that they're like showing a lot of leg or a lot of bosom. I mean like they're wearing a red petticoat and they will smile openly at a strange man without an introduction. I mean, that is very sexually forward behavior by mid-19th century standards. And everyone would have understood that. I mean, everyone would have understood that, you know, looking directly at a man who was unknown to you and smiling at him and making eye contact, that was an announcement that you might be interested in engaging in some kind of further intimate contact.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, that's kind of been a common theme amongst wars throughout history, hasn't it? Of this kind of following of prostitution with the army camps.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, well, it's interesting for many reasons. During the Civil War, as in other wars, wars have not only been characterized historically by an upsurge in prostitution, or at least an increased visibility of prostitution, but also an increased public awareness and concern, and in some cases medical advances about treating sexually transmitted infections. So there's actually a plot line in episode 1 that has to do with that theme of wartime efforts to curb the spread of venereal disease in a time and place in which casual sexual contact becomes, or sex trading becomes much more common. Another piece of it, though, that's interesting. Well, there are lots of pieces of it that are interesting. It's prostitution, of course. It's interesting. But another piece of it that's interesting is that Mercy Street, of course, several of the main characters are nurses, and the Civil War witnessed that was the first significant influx of American women into nursing in any significant numbers. Prior to that, nursing had been performed primarily by lower class servants or by convalescent soldiers. In the case of military hospitals, nursing was not respectable, nursing was not a profession, nursing was nothing, really. I mean, the Civil War is what made nursing a profession, and what made it, in particular, a women's profession. And because the women who hung around military camps were associated with prostitution, and many of them were, in fact, prostitutes, right? And because simply being in physical proximity with a strange man, particularly a strange man of different social status than your own, particularly a strange man of different social status than your own, who was not all the way dressed, right? I mean, all of those things were really shocking to Victorian sensibilities, and so nurses had to kind of bend over backwards to show that they were not sex workers, they were medical professionals, and they were not disreputable fallen women. They were, respectable, refined ladies. So it sets up a kind of an interesting dynamic in which, in order to avoid being cast as prostitutes, and therefore basically open to sexual advances from anyone, nurses had to go way the other direction and be sort of super respectable in order to not suffer the same loss of social protection that sex workers experienced.
It's really interesting.
I think so.
Yeah. So kind of switching gears a little, I'm curious, during this time period, are there documentations of same-sex couples or of women posing as the opposite gender to succeed? Things that would be out of the norm for the day.
Yes, there are definitely historical examples of both of those things, but they existed in a very different context from one another. So 19th century Americans really revered what they regarded as the sort of primarily feminine domain of the heart and emotion and connectedness, right? And so they placed this very high value on emotional intimacy, which they, for the most part, thought of as being very different from physical sexuality, right? So lust was, kind of base and something that humans shared with animals, but love was idyllic and something that humans shared with the divine, right? And so since women were associated with that kind of pure, disembodied love, that meant that women's same-sex relationships were really very highly revered and were often considered to be the ideal relationships because they were not in any way tainted either by, that nasty animal-like lust, supposedly, and also because they were not tainted by practical, pragmatic considerations, i.e. women had to marry because they had to have someone to support them, right? So therefore, female-to-female relationships were really viewed as the ideal, and until a couple of decades after the Civil War, were not perceived as being sexual relationships. What that meant in this kind of odd way was that this kind of cultural blindness to the possibility even that there was such a thing as same-sex sexuality where two women were concerned, men are a different issue, was that women could engage in these incredibly intimate and romantic and, in some cases, almost certainly sexual relationships without ever running the risk of social stigma or or being shunned by society. So 19th century women wrote very unselfconsciously. I mean, they wrote letters that you could only describe as love letters. They say things like, I wish I could sleep with you tonight. Of course, we would not sleep much, would we? But we would love each other and hold each other in each other's arms and whisper in each other's ears all night long. And, from our perspective, you look at that and you're like, oh, my God, they are so lesbians and they are so in love, right?
Yeah.
But that was commonplace, right? Yeah. And completely unselfconscious. There's without any sense that this was something that one needed to be ashamed of or that one needed to hide. 19th century Americans really, they placed a high value on privacy, but they also placed a very high value on self-revelation and this idea that you could share your inner self, your true self, your heart of hearts with another person, and that it was more likely that you were going to be able to do that with a person of your same gender. Because of your shared experience and background, and also because people believe that men and women were just kind of fundamentally different in terms of their capacity for emotional connection. So women's same-sex relationships then were completely acceptable and also completely invisible, right? So, and they often coexisted with heterosexual married life, with very conventional married life. So women who went to school together in the 19th century would have these passionate relationships all through school where they shared beds and they were never apart from one another, and when they wrote letters like the one I was just sort of paraphrasing for you, and then they would go back home, they would get married, they would obviously sleep with their husbands, they would have children, but they would continue to have this kind of very intimate correspondence going on, which is why we have so much rich written documentation. And we also know from that written documentation that they would exchange long visits, and when they exchanged long visits, hubby got kicked out of the bedroom so that the friends could be together. And everyone saw that as being perfectly normal.
Yeah.
And not problematic in any way. What would have been problematic is if you didn't have a friend like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And then there's cross-dressing, which was a completely different category. For historical reasons, we connect all of these different kinds of alternatives to heterosexuality and gender nonconformity. But in that context, there was nothing non-conforming about loving a member of one's own sex. That was normal. That was conforming, right? You were supposed to love members of your own sex. Cross-dressing was definitely non-conforming, very non-conforming, and there were laws against doing it, and you could be jailed in most locations for dressing in clothing of the other gender, and women did it well before the Civil War. Generally speaking, working class women who were doing so because it gave them more options in terms of employment, or alternatively women who were traveling because dressing as a man meant that they were much less subject to sexual harassment and assault if they were traveling alone without a quote male protector.
Yeah.
Right. So hence, right, single self-supporting women, whether they were trying to get a job or simply trying to travel from point A to point B in safety, had very good reasons for presenting themselves as men. The documentation is a little sketchy as to whether or not they actually identified themselves as men or simply self-consciously presented themselves as men. Mm-hmm. That's a little hard to get at from the historical record, right? I mean, you can say, okay, well, here's this female-bodied person who's wearing pants. So she's obviously presenting herself as a man. Does she actually think of herself as a man, or is this a calculated, strategy to reach a particular end? A little hard to say. A couple decades after the Civil War, you start to get a lot more documentation about that, and that's when you get the rise of the sexologists and the whole theory of the sexual invert and all that stuff. But that hasn't happened yet. As of the Civil War, that hasn't happened yet. So, and so it does appear that many women who cross-dressed did so for primarily, if not exclusively, practical purposes. And that was certainly the case for the roughly 300 women who dressed as men and served in the Civil War as soldiers.
Wow, I did not know there was so many.
Yes. Wow. So, yeah, they wanted to fight. Women couldn't fight, so they became men for the duration. Some of them continued to live as men after the war. Some of them immediately reverted to their previous identity. Some of them were discovered during the war, since if you're injured and you get undressed in the hospital, that can be a little difficult to hide. But unless that happened, it was pretty easy to hide, right? Because there were so many underage soldiers that it really wouldn't matter if a person in a man's uniform had no facial hair and did not have a particularly deep voice. Well, so what? I mean, that was true of the 14 and 15 and 16-year-old males in the Army as well, right? So in that sense, it was really quite easy to pass. And of course, it's not like Victorian clothing for either men or women was particularly revealing. So, so, I mean, as long as you can keep your clothes on, it's pretty easy to pass if that's your desire.
So what would the repercussions be for being discovered, say, in the Army, and you're a woman and it's discovered in a fashion?
Well, you would probably be sent to military prison. You would not be permitted to wear whatever. You would have to wear the clothes assigned to your gender. You couldn't wear the others. That would be illegal. I mean, there are documented cases, though, of women. I think it's Sarah Emma Edmonds. All these people have 3 names, so it's very confusing. But I think it's Sarah Emma Edmonds, who was arrested numerous times for dressing as a man, but she kept doing it anyway. And she served in the Army, and she originally wrote a memoir of her experiences, which is why we know so much about her.
Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Beneath the Covers, and make sure to tune in next week for a continuation of our interview on Mercy Street and life for women in the Civil War era. And as always, please remember to keep open minds and open hearts, and we will see you in the next video.